So yes, today is the second portion in the readings, and we get on to the story of Noah's flood. And of course, if you read the portion, how many of you read the portion? No? If you read the portion, you'll see that it was Noah and the whole family lines of Noah and his sons. And then you have the story of the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babel. And the beginning of Abraham's journey is part of this portion. The Haftarah portion is chosen from Isaiah 54, and that is probably because it has a reference to Noah. Isaiah 53, of course, is the chapter before that. There is a Haftarah reading from part of Isaiah 52, and then now we have one in 54, but not Isaiah 53. And it is true that there are many chapters and numerous prophets that are never read as part of the Haftarah, mostly because that would make the readings very lengthy. I think there's probably more words in that than there would be in the Torah itself. You might have heard the phrase before that Isaiah 53 is the forbidden chapter to be read among the Jews. That phrase comes almost exclusively from Christians, and more frequently Messianic Jewish congregations will make that point. They say it's forbidden to be read in Jewish circles because it clearly prophesies Yeshua. Now, if you look at strictly Jewish writers, they will say it's never forbidden. There's numerous claims that are repeated that a 17th century Jewish historian named Raphael Levi, claimed that this chapter used to be read in the synagogues as part of the Haftarah portion. He states the reason this messianic prophecy was removed from the readings is because it caused such heated arguments and confusion in the religious community that the rabbis decided to simply erase it from the Haftarah. Unfortunately, those who repeat this claim fail to provide the original source for this quote. I looked into it, and I found a Jewish person that was trying to find this as well and trying to address this topic himself. And he developed or came up with three possible candidates from the 17th century. This quote is supposedly from a 17th century rabbi, I guess, that was converted to Christianity. So, no, I'm sorry, that rabbi was not converted to Christianity. I'm sorry, I apologize for that. It was just a rabbi that supposedly made this comment somewhere in the 17th century. And so he identifies as Raphael Levi Hanover. This person was a German Jewish mathematician and astronomer. There's also a Raphael Levi, who was a Jew from Metz, France, who was burned at the stake for a blood libel claim, which was probably false, but that was part of the persecution of the Jews that's been ongoing since the beginning, it seems like. There's also a Raphael Levi that he identifies, which was a Jew from Constantinople in the 17th century as well, who converted to Christianity and became some priest, I guess maybe in the Orthodox Church. It would seem that this last one would be the better candidate, but I can't find any writings on this Raphael Levi from Constantinople. So based on that, and the Jew that did the research that came up with those names also didn't find any quotes to substantiate this claim that it was forbidden to be read or was taken out of the Haftarah readings. So based on all of that, unless you have some other source that I can't seem to find, I would just be careful about saying that the Jews are told not to be reading Isaiah 53. So, words to the wise on that one. Now, the only other prophet in Scripture who references the person of Noah is Ezekiel 43. I'm going to read this. This is Ezekiel 43. I'm going to read from 12 to 18. It says, "Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, if a country sins against me by committing unfaithfulness, and I stretch out my hand against it to destroy it, its supply of bread, and send famine against it, cut it off from both man and beast, even though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in the midst by their own righteousness, they could only deliver themselves, declares the Lord. If I were to cause the wild beasts to pass through the land, and they depopulate it, and it became desolate, so that no one would pass through it, and it became because of the beasts. Though these 3 men were in the midst, as I live, declares the Lord, that they could not deliver either their sons or their daughters. They alone would be delivered, but the country would be desolate. Or if I should bring a sword on that country and say, let the sword pass through the country and cut off man and beast from it, even though these 3 men were in the midst of it, as I live, declares the Lord, they could not deliver either their sons or their daughters, but they alone would be delivered. This is a reference to Noah, and apparently it also references, as you heard that, was it Job and Daniel, not Moshe, though I noticed, but anyway. So in the context of this particular reference, they're referencing these 3 men, including Noah, as being righteous. And what it seems to be saying here is that even though you have these righteous men in the land, that won't necessarily spare the land from God's judgment. And frankly, it's a little bit of a side, but it kind of works into the rest of my drosh, is that what that shows is that even the righteous men will live in a land that is getting judged by Elohim. So there will be judgment all around you. But right, he says it won't touch you, but man, it's going to be right up to your front door, right? It's going to be right in your face. And this calamity that's happening, and it's being orchestrated by Elohim, because nothing is done that gets away from Elohim's power. It's a bit of a somber message. In the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, Noah is mentioned in Hebrews 11 in the Hall of Faith. If you know Hebrews 11 or read it, it's the Hall of Faith. By faith Noah did this, by faith Abraham, by faith Sarah, faith. And there's a reason that he's listing all the patriarchs about faith, and Noah's listed there for good reason. It's also briefly mentioned, or Noah's name is briefly mentioned once in 1 Peter and 2 Peter. But our Brit Hadashah, our New Testament portion, is from Matthew 24, which is probably the most interesting reference to Noah in the New Testament. And I'm going to read this again. I think we might have read some of this here. But I'll read Matthew, chapter 24. I'm going to read 36 to 39. This is out of our heart, Devar. It says, but concerning that day and that hour, no man knows, not even the Melachim, the angels of heaven, but Ha'av, the Father alone. Just as in the days of Noah, so will be the coming of Ben Ha'adam, the Son of Man. For as the people before the flood were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing until the flood came and carried them all away. Such will be the coming of Ben Ha'adam. One of the comments I've made fast is about in contradiction, I guess, to some of the popular movies or TV series about, I forget what the name of it was, but about the end times where the whole world's freaking out and planes are flying out of the sky. You hear it, Yeshua says that, people won't know anything about it when this rapture happens. They'll go on living as if nothing ever happened. They will not know nothing about it. And so that makes me wonder how accurate that portrayal has been. And I've covered this before, but maybe there's some new people. Matthew 24 is a very apocalyptic prophecy of Yeshua. If you've read that, and it starts from verse 1, by the way. And this actually happens right after they leave the temple. And, Yeshua says, not one stone shall be left upon another, which will not be thrown down. And he's clearly talking about the second temple that was there in the first century. And after they sit on the mountain of, the Garden of Gethsemane, and they're looking back right at the temple. If you've ever been to Israel and sat there, seen that view, it's just right in front of you. You're sitting there, especially when it was all built up. It would just be literally right in your face, and you're staring right back at it as they have this conversation. And they ask him about 3 questions, if you read it very carefully. They say, when will these things happen? And they also say, what will be the sign of your coming? And what will be the end of the age, presumably the sign of the end of the age as well. It can be difficult to discern where Yeshua responds as he answers each of these questions. The things that are happening, or that they ask about the things that will happen, almost surely they were referencing the destruction of the temple that he had just prophesied as he was leaving. Yeshua goes on to explain that the destruction of the temple in substantial detail that turns out to be very accurate from historical records. We have the Jewish historian Josephus that wrote about it, and also the Roman Tacitus wrote about the destruction that happened in 70 AD, which was almost exactly 40 years after Yeshua spoke those words. The sign of your coming and the end of the age is where it gets more murky. What even is the end of the age? One could say the end of the age is the end of the Second Temple period. Maybe that was the end of the age. Or maybe that age is still in our future. I think more likely both. Certainly more likely both, I think, given Yeshua's kind of cryptic response. And that distant age being at least Yeshua's second coming, which is still in our future. But we have other cryptic, unfortunately, prophecies wrapped up around Yeshua's second coming, like the book of Revelation, and that seems to almost clutter up our understanding. Starting back in Matthew 24, though, starting in verse 36, Yeshua talks about the day that no man knows. And he says those days will be like the days of Noah. Now, I like to point out that there's two verses, or go back two verses prior to that, the day that no man knows. You go back two verses. This is Matthew now 24:34. And it says, this is where Yeshua says, this generation shall not pass away until all these things take place. So the day that no man knows, and the days like Noah, they're not really included in the shorter time frame where Yeshua sums them up in that generation. These things seem to more likely be speaking about more distant events, about his return and about the end of the age. So that's a place where you can kind of draw a distinction in the answer that Yeshua gives. Many have studied the tradition of the first century Jewish wedding and note that it appears to be a clear connection with Yeshua's only the Father knows when he makes this statement. I mentioned in my last drash how Yeshua used Jewish traditions to show how they point to himself. And this is probably another example of Elohim working the Jewish tradition into the Jewish people for similar purpose. There are many references and connections in the first century Jewish wedding with Scripture, and such that there's whole books written on the subject. So I'm not going to address all of that, I don't have time. But one of the key ones that I think fits Yeshua's statement is called the snatching of the bride as part of the Jewish wedding. The bride was frequently from another town from the groom, and after the ceremony causing them to be betrothed, the groom would return to his home and start building a house for him and his bride. Now this would take more than a few days. It was usually something on the order of a year time frame. And it was the father who oversaw and approved the construction of this house. And so it was only when the father agreed that the house was ready could the groom return and carry away his bride. Frequently, the last thing that was done to complete the house was to fix the door on the front. And it is said, supposedly, that when the groom was asked, when will your wedding be? The groom's response would be, I don't know, only my Father knows. And from there we have another connection to the story of Noah. Because after the stealing of his bride, which was frequently done with his groomsmen at night, they would sequester, that is the bride and the groom, would sequester in the bridal chamber for 7 days, where the relationship was consummated, number one. That's one of the things. But they would stay in there for 7 days. So the symbolism that follows this is that Elohim is the father, Yeshua is the groom, we're the bride, and this snatching away of the bride in the middle of the night kind of points to the concept of the rapture. The 7 days in the wedding chamber could be a number of things that I'm going to speculate here in a minute. And I think the Noah story helps possibly in that regard. Yeshua tells us something about the days of Noah that's not written in the Torah. And you go read starting from verse 28 of Matthew 24. He says, for as the people before the flood were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, they knew nothing until the flood came and carried them all away. Which such shall be the coming of Ben-Hadam, the Son of Man. So there's nothing in the Torah, if you go back and read the story of Noah, there's nothing in the Torah that talks about them eating or drinking or marrying. Presumably they were, but this is not mentioned. It's also not mentioned that they knew nothing until the flood. Of course, we trust that Yeshua on that one. Yeshua tells us the Noah's flood story is prophetic of the return of himself. It's the prophetic of the return of Yeshua. He tells us that specifically. It's like the days of Noah. And he gives us a particular point about that. But that tells me to go look at the story more closely and to see some of the symbolism that might, or most likely, I think, is to be inferred there. And so as for the 7 days we see in the Noah story, it says that after 7 days the flood came. That is, 7 days after Noah entered the ark. I think this 7 day here, and possibly the 7 days in the bridal chamber, might point to similar events, but they might not. I'll address that as well. Perhaps this represents the 7 years of tribulation we see in Daniel's last week of Daniel chapter 9. There's also the multiple 3.5 periods of Revelation, which are presumed to be 3.5 added together to be 7 years total. Actually, if you add the total 3.5s in Revelation, there's like 7 3.5s. If they're all concurrent with each other, there's way more than 7 years, but I don't think that's what's implied there. The vast majority of people that read Revelation find this total of 7-year period of a tribulation. So both of those have a 7-day holding period in a protected place after the snatching away. The bride is snatched from her home, and Noah is kind of taken from the earth into the ark. These seem to be symbolic of the rapture event. But after this event, they're sequestered away from the world for 7 days. I believe this points to a pre-trib rapture potentially. Hey, we've had that many. I'd like to see your post-trib rapture verses. I think I've asked for those. You probably told me that once and I forgot about now, but I know I've read that once or twice. This is assuming we believe in such a rapture, as we do, I think. But then there's the debates, about is it pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib. A lot of debates about that. But I rarely see those defending the pre-trib rapture position use this as evidence. But I think it's a pretty powerful piece of evidence. Now, let me read the story of Noah again. I think I might have read some of these, but let me read it again. I want to go back to Genesis. This is chapter 7. I'm going to read 7 through 9. And Noah went in, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him, into the ark, because of the waters of the flood. And of the clean beasts and of the beasts that were not clean, of the fowls and everything that creeps upon the ground, there went in two and two unto Noah and into the ark, male and female, as Elohim commanded Noah. And it came to pass that after 7 days, then the waters of the flood were upon the earth. And so, like I said, it's after 7 days, or the 7 days before this destruction of the flood. And I think, again, that points to a picture of the Natsal, or the rapture, him being taken out of the world into this safe place, heaven presumably. And it's the beginning of this 7-day period, which is, again, points to the beginning of the 7-year tribulation period before the destruction comes. But I recently kind of understood or noticed another thing that I hadn't noticed for a long time. And you back up a few more verses, and I'm going to go to Genesis chapter 7, verse 2. And it says, of every clean beast you shall take to you 7 and 7s, each with this mate. And the beasts that are not clean, 2, each with this mate. Here I believe the clean animals represent Jews who are saved, and the unclean represent the Gentiles who are also saved. Something I never thought about. I always thought about Noah's family representing saved people. But what are the animals? And so much like Acts chapter 10, where the sheet comes down, you got clean and unclean animals, and we learn that in that story that Peter says, hey, now I know that we're not to call any man unclean, and therefore is pretty clearly inferred that from that vision he understands that the clean animals represent the Jews who are keeping kosher, and the unclean animals represent the Gentiles. And so I think that would apply here as well. Of course, you don't think about this because at the time that Noah's flood happened, there was no such thing as Jews, right? They hadn't really been birthed out yet through the lineage. But yeah, he knows the beginning from the end, right? So he could easily have put this into his word. But I noticed there are 7 pairs of the clean animals. And if those represent Jews in the rapture, this would tell me potentially that near the end times, there was possibly a large conversion or salvation of the Jewish people, like a mass salvation of Jewish people. That's why there's 7 pairs of, there's a whole lot of Jews represented in Noah's Ark, if that's the clean animals. So that points to a time, which I think Revelation talks about that, the 144,000, but there's probably more. Those are the ones that were really on fire. So yeah, there is a future mass conversion or salvation of the Jews to believing in Yeshua as Messiah. But it does appear that that would point to this happening near the end times events, near the tribulation events. As for the wedding chamber for 7 days, this doesn't fit as well because there really is no tribulation at a wedding. And when they come out of after the 7 days, there's the big party with the feast and all the family. So perhaps the 7 days of the wedding chamber doesn't fit the point to a tribulation, or does not point to a tribulation, but it points, I think, possibly now I'm thinking this again, to the 7th day of the world week. So the 7 days points to the 7th day of the world week, which is when we believe that Yeshua will reign during the millennial kingdom. And after the 7 days, after the 7th day, is eternity and an eternal celebration. So that would fit better for the picture of a wedding, right? And so you have the 7 days represents the 7th day or the 7th millennium, the millennial reign, where the bride reigns with Yeshua. But then you also have, after they're out, that would be the 8th day. And the 8th day, again, points to eternity, the new heaven and the new earth, in which, again, you have people there. There's no tribulation at all in this whole picture. And so the 8th day, again, will represent the family that have this feast that represents eternity. Maybe that's a better fit. But also, what that would show, if it is correct, that there's a select few of saved people that reign with him, but there are other people, the family, who are saved for all eternity that aren't necessarily part of the millennial kingdom reign. I think there's other places that will suggest that that's a distinct possibility. So that not all saved people will reign with him during the millennial kingdom. We've talked about the world week concept before, and I mentioned it here. And I may have had a slide once before on this. If I did, it was so long ago, I don't remember it. I've recreated another one. Now, this concept of the 7-day world week is never overtly stated in Scripture. But it does seem to be a pattern that's buried or hidden in Scripture. There's a verse in Scripture that says it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, and it's the glory of kings to seek a matter out. The world week concept is based on the days. A day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. And it starts from the 7 days of creation and extends out from there 7,000 years. And do I have the slide up? Okay, I created a slide here that tries to define this, and we've talked about it, but I just defined it a little bit better. And so I have the days on the left. You have the 2 days of man, and then the 2 days of Israel, and then the 2 days of Messiah, and then the day of the Lord. That's the day of the Lord. The 7th day is this reign of Yeshua, the millennial kingdom. And I have the men that appear to mark those days, Adam being the first, and then the next column is the years from Adam, counting forward from Adam to the present day. And the last column is kind of our modern accounting of years, where Yeshua was born about 3 BC, and then we count forward from there. And so we've been counting forward pretty accurately from the time of Yeshua. That's 2,000 years from the time of Yeshua. Now, if you go backwards from there, you back up about 1,000 BC, which is when you find King David, give or take, about 1,000 BC. And you have references in the book of Kings to other kingdoms, right? You have references back there to the Babylons and the Medes and the Persians. And there's other archaeology and stuff that can date that. Oh, so now I'm kind of fixing that date at about 1,000 BC. And then from there, I can back up by going into Scripture, backing up for the days of Abraham. And then you back up, through the period of the Judges. And those aren't exact, but they're pretty close. 400 years in Egypt, 400 years of Judges, And then you get back to where it's very clear, it's the begats, right? So years, and then you begat, and then you back it up. And that's how you get to about 4,000 BC. And so when people say, the earth is 6,000 years old, it was created 6,000 years ago, that's how they're doing it. I mean, they're getting that number kind of that way. It's not exact, but it's pretty close. The ambiguity is somewhere around the time of the kings. How accurately have we pegged what's in Scripture to an actual king that we can date out there? But it's likely pretty accurate, within a few dozen years for most of that. And so that's why I have the two columns, the one stating going back to 4,000 BC, and the one starting from Adam. And so if you start from Adam and you add up the begats, right? Adam lived so many years and then begat so-and-so, and then he lived so many years and begat this guy. They're very detailed and very accurate. You find that Noah was born 1,056 years after Adam, which is almost exactly 1,000 years. Now, Noah lived for hundreds of years before the flood came, but anyway, he as a man represents the second day of man, right? Noah and his family repopulated the earth. And so you have this day of man, which is all the wicked men that died in the flood. And the whole earth got renewed with a man in Noah. So that's the second day. That's why he represents the second day of man. And that seems very fitting when you look at it that way. Again, you can add up all the begats, and you'll find that Abraham was born 1,948 years after Adam in one of the calculations you did, and I showed the 1950s there as well. Jill's not here. What happened to Jill? Oh, huh? Tom's here. She's out of town. Okay. And Jill gave me a sheet that showed this, and they showed 1950 for Adam. I'm like, where'd you get that? I looked up to it. I looked it up, and it turns out there's two different numbers. Unfortunately, they don't add up exactly the same. The 1948 is the begat. If you stay on that lineage, you get to the 1948. The 1950 comes where it says something happened 2 years after an event, and then you back up for the years of that event, and you actually get a number that's a little bit different. So I threw that in there, although I prefer the 1948. I prefer the 1948 because that's an interesting date in history, right? So again, why was Yeshua not born in 0 BC or 3 BC? However it happened, it just so happens that for the history of the world will ever forever known that Israel was reestablished in the year 1948. And it seems like Elohim maybe worked that interesting number for a purpose, because they considered themselves Abraham, their father, who was also 1948 after Adam. Amazing coincidence, and there's no coincidences, but some of these patterns, though, I think is what's very powerful proof that there is something more than a man that wrote these words. There's no way a man could have buried such mysteries in there that we are asked to seek out. It's his glory that he has concealed these in there. And so you move forward from Abraham about another 1,000 years or so, and then you have King David comes on board about 3,000 BC. About 3,000 years after Adam, which is 1,000 BC. And then you come to Yeshua. So yeah, Yeshua was born 2,000 years ago, which is about 4,000 years after Adam. And then you get forward. There's no specific date that happened at 1,000 AD, although if you go read history, there were a lot of people freaking out thinking Yeshua was going to come back, right? Something about the millennial, and yeah, there was a lot of speculation about Yeshua returning and the end of the world and all that at about 1,000 AD. Obviously, that came and went more than 1,000 years and turned out not to be true. And so now we're about 2,000 years after the time of Yeshua. So we're in we're basically right at near the end of the 6th day, which is the second day of Messiah. And so shortly we'll be turning into maybe, right, the 7th day, which would be the day of the Lord, the reign. Now, exactly when does that happen? Well, nobody knows. That's kind of where I cut my drosh off, right there. So we can finish a little early, so I don't have a very good ending on that. But I will say that, I think I've said it before that I believe there's going to be lots of speculation and craziness out there as we get closer and closer to the 2,000 years from the time that Yeshua was crucified or executed, which, depending on whose history you're looking at, they'll say between about 30 and 33 AD is about when he happened. So he had a ministry that lasted, oddly enough, about exactly 3.5 years, by the way. His public ministry was about 3.5 years long. And his execution was probably not much earlier, around 30, but maybe not much later than 33 AD. And so as we reach 2030 and 2033 AD, I believe there's going to be a lot of people telling you that the end of the world is at hand. And I can't say for a fact that they're wrong, right? I have some speculation and belief why there's reason to believe that these summer days that we're in are longer days, but I could be wrong about that. I could be wrong about the whole world week, right? But there's a pattern there that really seems to fit when you look at it. Again, Elohim says it's his glory to conceal the matter, and it's our glory to seek the matter out. So we just need to keep that in mind. So I have a non-biblical reason why I think there's going to be something. If I had to predict, just kind of like from the market standpoint, I think this whole AI-driven thing is going to increase profits for companies without expenses. So I think companies are going to be very profitable in the next several years due to incorporating that. Their revenues are going up without their expenses going up. Very profitable, which is going to be good for the stock market, good for the economy. Everybody's happy. But I think there's potentially a dot-com level bubble coming at the end of that, probably thrown in there with some drone strikes to really create a real black swan event in our economy and larger layoffs and such. But that's completely speculation based on economics and nothing to do with the Bible. But it coincidentally would land very similar to around 2030 or so time frame. So if that does happen, that may not be the end of the world, and I may have predicted that wrong. So I'm not making any firm predictions on things like that. But it is in our scripture, and it is something that we look at from time to time because we don't shy away from that. We look at all of scripture, and but we also take it, I guess, correctly weighted, let's say. So that's about all I have on that. So I'm going to end that with a Shabbat Shalom.